Hi, welcome to Climate Challenge, the first and only media program in the nation dedicated exclusively to climate change and related issues. I'm your host, Karen Strickler, and today we have the great pleasure of talking with Cory Morningstar. She's a writer and an activist. She recently contributed to what's called the People's Agreement on Climate Change in Cochabamba in 2010. Ms. Morningstar joined the International Advisory Board of what's called the Climate Forum. She serves as chair of the Advisory Committee on the Environment to the City of London. She believes in direct action and initiated the grassroots group called Canadians for Action on Climate Change. Her most well-known piece of writing was written after the last international meeting on climate change in Copenhagen, which she called a disaster, and her article is entitled Eyes Wide Shut, Tick, Tick, Tick Expose from an Activist Insider. Oil Sands Truth named it, quote, one of the most important articles climate campaigners will ever read. Welcome to Climate Challenge, Cory.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Could we start out by having you summarize your article, Eyes Wide Shut, for us?
Basically, Eyes Wide Shut was written after Copenhagen. I've been working with NGOs all over the world and in Canada, and I knew something was up. I couldn't understand why we were getting nowhere with the scientific information where we needed to go on climate. And there's definitely a wall put up by the NGOs. And so after Copenhagen, when it was clear that, the G77 in Bolivia a year ago asked NGOs to support the targets necessary to avert climate catastrophe. They were 1 degree and really severe emission cuts by developed countries, 52% by 2015, 65% by 2020, 80% by 2030, well over 100% by 2050. And what happened, none of the NGOs, the speech, I believe his name was Lumumba Daping, he was an amazing speaker from Sudan, and people in the room, including Can International, stood up and gave him this amazing applause. I mean, he just moved people. He was so sincere and, begging for the lives of his people. And the NGOs went out and, kept hammering in on 2 degrees again. And I just say,
Cory, when you say NGOs, tell us who you're talking about.
I'm talking about the big greens. I'm talking about Greenpeace International. I'm talking about Tick, Tick, Tick at that time was a massive campaign, an umbrella group which brought under it hundreds of NGOs. And Can International, incidentally set up by Environmental Defense Fund, Michael Oppenheimer, I believe his name is, that was set up back in the late 80s. And that speaks for all the NGOs. So instead of having separately, 500 voices at these climate conferences, we have one voice speaking for everyone. And that voice is, for the most part, a corporate front group voice. So after Copenhagen, I started doing research into this tick, 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 because I just knew something was up with it, And I found out it was created by Havis, which is one of the largest media organizations in the world, partnered with EDF, who's the leading nuclear corporate, multinational corporation in the world. And so basically all these massive corporate partners, oil, banks, and aviation industry, you name it, all partnered with this tick, tick, tick. And we were able to, myself and another woman helped me investigate. We were able to get our hands on a release from Havis that actually states that the whole purpose of the campaign was to exploit consumers, to exploit the media, to exploit. And it's just, crazy stuff. It's nasty, and it's these are major, major barriers to our movement that we have to get going before it's too late. And they basically drown out the the grassroots voice of the real, legitimate climate activists. So I'm talking about Greenpeace. I'm talking about Can. I'm talking about 350.org. I'm talking about, there's a slew of them in the States.
Okay, we're going to talk more about them in a little bit. But for now, let's talk about what might be seen as an alternative to this corporate-controlled climate movement that you're discussing. And for example, we're just coming off the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's meeting in Cancun, and again, we're going to talk about that. But at that meeting, Bolivian President Evo Morales said, quote, "I'm convinced that if the presidents take on their responsibility, not to certain powers such as multinational companies, but instead to people and social movements, we can advance." He asks, why don't states go to the People's Summit in Cancun and listen to the concrete proposals of social movements who come here with representing victims of global warming? Now, you've participated in writing what's called the People's Agreement in Cochabamba in 2010, which sounds like an alternative to this corporate campaign that you've just mentioned. Please explain to our audience what that agreement does, who's behind it, and so forth.
Yeah, the agreement basically, it's an agreement, the only agreement actually that exists in the world that could actually save civilization from climate catastrophe, which is, you know, right around the corner if we haven't passed the tipping points already. The agreement's based on our interwoven relationship with nature. So it's based on human rights, it's based on indigenous rights, it's based on saying, you know, unequivocal no to commodifying nature's last resources.
What kind of greenhouse gas cuts does it call for?
1 degree, to stabilize temperatures at 1 degree, and to bring them back down to 300 parts per million, back down to pre-industrial levels.
So down to 280 parts per million?
Yeah, protection of rights for Mother Earth, basically just rejecting false solutions and really going back to developing a relationship with Earth where we can sustain ourselves and sustain all life with us.
So contrast that for us then, Cory, with what actually happened in Cancun at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meeting that's just wrapping up in Cancun.
Well, the Cancun meeting, it's, you know, it's totally crazy because you got NGOs now in the past day or two telling their supporters that we've got, you know, progress, that, you know, this is a victory, that, you know, it's a success. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. Cancun is an absolutely disaster. What's happened is nothing less than the greatest crime ever committed against humanity as a whole. What's happened will definitely, you know, we're looking at possibly wiping out as many as, you know, 5 billion people by the year 2050. That's from Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Institute, one of the world's foremost leading climate scientists. We've got, you know, it's just a disaster. If you can try to wrap your head around this, what's happening, all these agreements are based on, they're not based on people, they're based on profits, they're based on corporate profits. We've got the corporations running the governments here. And the last item on the agenda is human life. I mean, we're just not even part of the discussion. This has been called by someone within the IPCC the greatest economic conference since the last World War. I mean, this is about profit. This is about money. This is about, you know, turning the last remaining resources on our planet into money. I mean, that's what it's all about. So if you can come to terms with that, then
so it's not really about addressing climate change.
It's not addressing the environment at all.
What do you think should have happened in Cancun?
What should have happened in Cancun is a plan, an immediate plan, like a wartime mobilization to zero. Because without zero,
explain zero what?
Zero emissions.
Zero carbon emissions.
Zero emissions, all emissions. We have to get to -0. Before temperatures can go back, before the atmospheric carbon can decrease, we have to get to zero. That's a scientific fact. That's within the IPCC documents. And that is something that no big greens, no one actually in the justice movement as well, no one wants to talk about that. If we don't do that, we might as well do nothing, because that's the only way to get back to where we need to go. There's no other way. And you know, I can't say his name, Hans Schnellhuber from he's the advisor to the EU government, last year actually gave a conference to Obama, like went in and talked to Obama and his administration. Canada, US, and Australia have less than a decade to get to zero carbon per capita to stay within a 2-degree threshold. 2 degrees is disaster.
That's 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, you
Yeah.
just wrote an expose, which you entitled The 2-Degree Death Dance, 1 Degree Cover-Up.
Yeah.
Can you quickly summarize that article for us?
Yeah, basically I went back because, I mean, we keep talking about staying within the threshold of 2 degrees when 1 degree is obviously completely dangerous. What we have happening today under 1 degree is insane. I mean, you don't have to do any more modeling to see what's happening under 1 is dangerous. And but we keep talking about 2 as if we can continue, you know, business as usual. We can keep going until 2. So I went back to the 1980s and started investigating how we got to this high number. And it turns out that in 1990, there was an advisory group, a United Nations advisory group on greenhouse gases. And there's a document that's nowhere online that I've been able to find, but I found the information for it. There's a document written where 1 degree is the cited safe, low risk limit. 2 degrees was recognized back then as an extremely high risk limit.
In fact, your expose says, if I may quote from it, today this 2-degree target, largely defined as a maximum allowable warming to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate, has replaced the almost unknown 1 degree Celsius rise in average global temperature that was highlighted in the 1990 United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases report when climate change was virtually an unknown issue. And you go on to say, quote, beyond, or I think this is the United Nations that says this, quote, beyond 1 degree Celsius may elicit explicit, rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. In 2 minutes, tell us, if that's true, why does everyone think 2 degrees Celsius rise in average global temperature is the standard?
We've just been inundated with, you know, corporate crap, and we've just been, it's almost internalized. I mean, we've been inundated with it for decades, and we've been sold a lie that our quality of life is dependent upon the economy and, you know, material wealth. And this, you know, meanwhile, as material wealth has risen since, you know, since the 50s, quality of life has deteriorated. So we've been told this great big lie. We've been fed it, we bought it, you know, they sold it, we bought it. And now we've got to get out of that, and people are starting to recognize it. But it's just, you know, propaganda at its finest, media's corporate media. You know, you have to remember everything is controlled. Even our governments are all controlled by these multinational corporations. And this is why we're not making a dent in the fight against climate change. This is all about corporate profits, not about the environment. It's not about people.
Okay, and we need to take a break in just a minute, but you are working on a controversial new book. Can you tell us what it's called and what it's about? Again, 60 seconds before we take our break.
Yeah, it's about basically, okay, how do we get here? Here we are, almost 20 years.
What's it called, Cory?
Well, the title, you know, it's not really, it's tentative right now. Right now it's called
From the Nonprofit Industrial Complex with Love?
That's the tentative title right now.
Okay, that's the working title.
Yeah, it's the working title. Basically, it's about, you know, 1992, the world made a commitment not to go beyond dangerous climate interference. Here we are, almost 20 years later, right? And our emissions have risen 40%. And yet we keep, for some reason, you know, it's like Einstein says, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again. And yet we continue to believe that, you know, voluntarily these corporations and governments are going to go to zero carbon and get rid of fossil fuel and give up all these, you know, massive, massive, massive profits. We continue to believe that somehow, you know, the plutocracy and the elites that control the whole global economy are going to give up that power. We continue to believe that the NGOs who have completely sold out the people are going to somehow, you know, become legitimate. And once, you know, they understand that, you know, the real science, or once they understand how dangerous it is, that they're all going to come and save us and become good and pure and clean and ethical. And so it's like so the whole book is basically, how did we get here? I mean, it's so delusional. Like, how did we come to believe all this, all this crap that we've been like spoon fed? So that's the book, and it's about going back and uncovering, the makings of groups like One Sky, all the groups that the Rockefellers have put into play.
We'll talk more about them after the break, Cory.
Sure.
And now we're going to take a break. This is Climate Challenge. I'm your host, Karen Strickler. See you after the break.
So, Malcolm, you do know that energy savers last 6 times longer than ordinary light bulbs.
This isn't my room. It's Baron Davis's.
Baron Davis, the basketball player? This is his room?
Yep.
Interesting, because we have Baron Davis right here. Baron, do you live here?
No.
I don't mean that, Baron Davis.
Millions of kids are using their energy wisely. What's your excuse?
Hi, welcome back to Climate Challenge. I'm your host, Karen Strickler, and we're talking today with Cory Morningstar. She's a writer and a climate activist. Cory, you've been very critical of national environmental organizations on the issue of climate change. In a recent article entitled "Mainstream Greens Cave In on Climate," you wrote, "With climate scientists warning that we're in a global emergency and tipping points leading to runaway catastrophe will be crossed unless carbon pollution is rapidly reduced, one would expect groups identified as environmental defenders to be shifting into high gear." Who are some of these groups that you're talking about? And if they're not shifting into high gear, what are they doing about climate change?
They're not doing anything. And actually, if you go to their websites, you're hard-pressed to even find any kind of position on climate change at all. And they put out numbers like, for example, tick, tick, tick. We confronted them. Last year, they had 40% by 2020 with no baseline, and then finally they said, oh, well, that was a mistake. It was, yeah, you're right. There's no baseline. I mean, these things are absolutely meaningless. And when you look at their positions, or when they put something out, and if you can look at them critically, you see they mean nothing. After the BP oil spill, we saw organizations demanding a moratorium on all new oil drilling. So think about that, moratorium. So we'll, sort of stop for now on anything new. So what that really means is business as usual on everything that's existing. And so these organizations have all become, they're corporately funded by foundations set up by corporations, money funneled through from corporations that make massive amounts of money from oil into foundations onto NGOs. And so what this gives you is an illusion of democracy, and it's just that, an illusion. They're just basically giving the message that is already agreed upon at the other end. And so they're controlled and massaged, and sort of, it's all very, very much an illusion, and it's very, very much brand and brand protection. These are huge, organizations with million-dollar budgets. Some of them actually registered as corporations, and they're in the business of protecting that brand and making sure that those funds keep coming in.
Cory, in your article, Mainstream Greens Cave on Climate Change, you make 8 concrete suggestions about what these environmental groups should be doing. What are some of those things?
Well, one of the most important things that we have to be doing is we need the groups to declare a planetary emergency. We are in a planetary emergency. There's no doubt about it. John Holdren, who's in the Obama administration, has been telling us this since 2006, that the world is beyond dangerous. Okay, so that's what the whole point of the negotiations were back in '92, to not go beyond dangerous climate interference. We have gone beyond dangerous climate interference already at below 1 degree. We need to call a planetary emergency. I mean, scientists say they can't, that it's a value judgment, and that only civil society can make that value judgment. These groups claim to represent civil society, so declare the emergency. I mean, who's going to do it? And, Hansen, like 350 is always about, oh, Hansen's science, Hansen's science. Hansen's been, practically pleading for someone to call a planetary climate emergency since 2008.
This is James Hansen. This is James Hansen, renowned NASA climate scientist.
Yes. Yes. So we need wartime mobilization. You know, it has to be done fast. The developed countries have years, not decades, to get to zero. How are we going to get there? Where's the plan? You know, and I think it's just, you know, ethically and morally, you know.
What do you think is the plan for getting there, Cory?
Well, we have no plan. We have to get to zero fossil fuels, and no one's willing to even, you know, there's socialism at play here, and people don't want to even believe that we can live in an economy without fossil fuels. I mean, people just don't want to believe it. We don't even want to talk about it, and that has to be the discussion, and that has to be the dialogue, and we're still not even talking about it. So why even bother talking about 350 through 300, 280 if we're not even going to talk about getting to zero?
You're saying we need to get to zero greenhouse gas emissions, we need to get off the fossil fuel economy, and interestingly, I quoted some of your rather devastating blows against 350.org and Bill McKibben in a recent interview that I did with him, and I thought it was rather earth-shattering that he said that he supported getting to zero carbon emissions and getting off the fossil fuel economy. What do you make of that? Have you ever heard him say it before? Do you think he's serious? What does he need to do with that now?
I thought it was a really powerful interview because that is the first time I've ever heard Bill McKibben say that. And what he needs to do is tell his supporters that if we don't do it, that we're wiping out our entire species and taking all the other species with it. And so, again, why is it that these groups will not tell the truth to their supporters? Why is it these groups will not tell their supporters what needs to happen to get to zero? I mean, this whole capitalist economic system is the root of climate change. We have to change the way we interact with nature and our planet, upon which graciously, this planet graciously sustains us. And these are the root problems we have to be looking at. We can't solve them by doing the same thing over again, and that's what Cancun's all about, like how to turn everything that's left back into cash, and how to rape and exploit, everything that's left. We've already done that, and look where it's gotten us. It hasn't worked. It's failed. It's like it's the worst failure and experiments in the history of the world. So why would we do it again?
Okay, Cory, is all this just infighting among environmentalists, or is it really critical to the terms of the debate?
It's critical. I mean, how do you expect people to act, in an emergency fashion when they have no idea that we're in an emergency? And they honestly, most people have no idea. And, what these groups do, they drown out, like I said, they drown out the voices of the legitimate grassroots who are saying, what's happening with science. They are telling us it's an emergency. They are saying no to red, no to carbon markets.
Tell us who some of these legitimate grassroots groups are.
These are the ones mostly being affected on the front lines: the Ocean Pacific, Libya Campesina, the Indigenous Environmental Network. These are the people on the front lines that will be hit first. So.
Do you have hope, Cory, that humanity will ultimately get it right when it comes to climate change?
I have hope, if we can peel off the layers and layers of, stuff we've been inundated with over the past decades and stuff that's been internalized. It's sort of we've sort of become an ethically bankrupt society. But I have hope. I mean, I have to have hope. I have kids, and I love my planet, and you have to keep working towards hope. You do.
Exactly.
But if you, at the same time, I hate to even use that word because that's what they all use. Oh, hope, hope, hope. And you can hope all this stuff to death, and it's not going to do anything. So what we need is action, and we need concrete goals and concrete plans. And, all the people with the resources are basically lying to their supporters and telling them nothing. So,
where do you find hope within the climate movement? In 30 seconds, Cory, we've got to wrap it up after that.
I find hope within the climate movement from people, other activists I know that refuse to compromise and refuse to sell out our brothers and sisters around the globe that are going to be wiped out ahead of us. Those are the people that I find hope from, those people that fight and fight for the truth and fight and won't accept compromise.
Great. Thank you very much, Cory. And now it's time for my commentary, Hot Air. Climate change and its profoundly adverse consequences on the planet and the people is arguably the most urgent issue of all time. We have a moral obligation to contain the rise in average global temperature and greenhouse gases, to keep that temperature at less than 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to keep atmospheric carbon dioxide at around 300 parts per million. We are currently at 390 parts per million carbon dioxide and rising 2 parts annually. And 350 is the upper safe limit. And the average global temperature has already risen 0.8 degrees Celsius, with accompanying weather extremes of all sorts. A rise in average global temperatures above 1 degree Celsius is acknowledged to be the point at which global land and water and air will become victims of vicious climate feedback cycles, destabilizing ecosystems and human societies. Strict timelines must be enforced for cutting greenhouse gas and atmospheric CO2. We should cut emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2025, with the ultimate goal of zero emissions by no later than 2050. We're already feeling the effects of 390 parts per million and 0.8 degrees Celsius rise in average global temperature. It's not just affecting faraway places like the floods in Pakistan or the wildfires in Russia. Our studios are in the state of Maryland in the United States, where 22 out of 23 Maryland counties were declared federal disaster areas this past summer due to extreme drought related to climate change. Let your elected representatives know that we must do the things that we discussed. This has been Hot Air on Climate Challenge. I'm your host, Karen Strickler. See you next time.